Welcome. In today's video we're going to look at the summer reading for AP Psychology, which is 50 Great Myths of Popular Psychology. It took quite a while to figure out which book exactly we were going to read and concentrate on for a summer reading, and there are a lot of options, but this is a book that many people have chosen, even in college classes. And when you look at this book, it covers so much of what we're going to talk about during the semester that it just seems like the perfect choice. Hopefully, if you've got a chance to start reading it, you'll be turned on or interested by the topics that are discussed. It should give you a pretty good sense of the kind of things we're going to study throughout the semester. So let's take a look at it here. The first quote on the first screen says, "Science must begin with myths and with the criticism of myths." And I think that's exactly what they're doing here. There's a popular psychology perspective of things. Often that's wrong. There's also just a human nature basis that we have that we kind of fall prey to all the time, and mistakes that we make. This book does a good job of uncovering a lot of those things. So, first thing I wanted to mention here was that this video, along with the notes for this video and anything else that might be important for the course, you'll find on the website, which is right there, apsych.mrduez.com. And the email address, pretty important, because if you have any questions while reading this book or anything about the course in general, just shoot me an email. It's at david.duez@gmail.com. For sure, I'll be able to get it if you send it there. If you go to the website and you look at the top bar there beneath the banner, you'll see AP Psych is the home page. It's kind of yellow there, and anything you click on here will kind of turn yellow, and that'll be the topic of the page. Notes is a place you'll spend a lot of time looking at presentations and the videos that I've uploaded to kind of help you get a sense of what we're doing in class. You can check out the calendar, some of the other things that are listed across there, like AP Test Review. Got some video links up there, some tips about the class extra credit project that you can read up about now, although it's not necessary at this point. The video project at the end of the semester, a little bit about myself, and a little bit about the course. So it's important that you check out the website, especially like the first week of school. We'll have the survey link up there as well, and I want to get some information from you so that I can make sure to communicate and get information to you, especially for fall semester students, because then in the spring the AP test won't happen until May. This will give us a chance to keep communicating and let you know when review sessions and those types of things will come up. So there are 5 big questions I want you to consider while reading the book. The first is, do you agree with the 50 myths? It may seem like a lot, but there aren't, they don't go through chapters and chapters on each myth. Some myths are only a few pages long. I've been flipping through this and reading with my nice little light here. It's pretty handy. But the book, I think, is a nice summer read because you don't have to think of it in terms of like reading a novel, or even, I don't know, a history book that would be long in terms of like, if you put it down at some point during the summer, if you had to pick it back up, are you going to remember what you had covered already? That's the nice thing about this book. It is really in parts. So if I've read myth 18 right here and finished that up, and I've gone to the beach for a couple weeks and I've come home, and you pick it back up and start with the next part, altered states, which is about consciousness. You'll flip through here and you should be fine. I mean, you should pick right up where you left off, and you don't have to really worry about kind of keeping all this memorized as you go. So what I want you to do as you go through is just kind of make note about the argument that they make. Do you agree that researchers have demonstrated that dreams possess symbolic meaning? That's myth. Do you agree that they do have meaning, dreams? Well, the authors of the book, which is the main author, Scott O. Lilienfeld, he will make lots of claims here. Like, here's one. Perhaps not surprisingly, the results of a recent Newsweek poll revealed 43% of Americans believe that dreams reflect unconscious desires. That's in 2006. Moreover, researchers who conducted surveys in India, South Korea, and the United States discovered that 56% to 74% of people across 3 cultures believe that dreams can reveal hidden truths. And they mention a study in parentheses there, and that's 2009. So they'll go on to claim that that's actually not true, and they'll use a lot of different studies and statistics and research to try and prove their case. So I think it's a really valuable book. Which of the 50 don't you agree with? And which myth surprised you the most? What's the one where you were sure that that actually was, a real deal? That you didn't know that there was, in fact, you were less safe in larger groups. That's one that most people wouldn't believe, but that is definitely true, and especially in certain groups. So explain why and how. I mean, I would jot these down so you're having a working knowledge of what you're reading when you come to class in the fall or in the spring semester. Especially if it's a spring semester, you may not have looked at this for a few months. You're going to want to have some notes to refer to, and that's fine. I mean, you can flip through those and you'll get caught up pretty quickly. The third question is, what is psychology and how is it a science? So the book definitely gives you a nice introduction to what the class is all about, and I hope that you can define what psychology is and how it operates as a science after having read it. What purpose does research serve in psychology? This is really what the book is about, debunking myths and common misperceptions, but using science to do that in scientific study. Maybe you don't believe that psychology is a science. I've had some students in the past who are real hardcore math science guys, and they're like, Duez, I'm really into history, and I liked you as a history teacher. I don't know how this is going to go with psych, because I'm not sure I really get this soft science, if you will. But I think that there is a lot of science, and it has to be, to prove the points that people are trying to make. And sometimes theory gets confused with not being scientific enough, but it has to start someplace. Number 4, what purpose does research serve in psychology? So that is going right along with what I've talked about with these other questions. Number 5, which area of psychology will you enjoy studying the most? And we'll look at some of those areas here as we flip through this too, and give you a sense where the book will impact the course that we're going to study, how the textbook relates to the summer reading book, and then also the AP course. And we'll even look a little bit at what the AP test will look like for you. Look at an FRQ, and we'll look at a multiple choice question. So we'll do that now. First, this is on here for you to read if you want, but this is straight off of the AP website about AP psychology. Something to consider here is AP is advanced placement. So if you are a willing and academically prepared student and you want to pursue college level study, this is a good class for you, because I think you have a chance to earn college credit, potentially. Qualifying score, typically eligible to receive college credit and or placement into advanced courses in college. And psychology is the kind of course that if you can possibly do this, it would save you a lot of time, is to eliminate that introduction psychology course. Maybe if you're interested in psychology, take something far more interesting. Like, we look at the topics down the left hand side here, every single one of them could be potentially a semester long course. So what I find interesting is if you're really into like social psychology, and I've had students like that in the past, and they take an intro to psych class and they're hoping they can get through that really quickly and get on to social psych. Well, if you've already had AP psych and you've gotten credit, you can move on and take a more advanced class if you'd like. And many times those class sizes are smaller, the subject's more interesting, the professor's more into it, rather than surveying quickly through psychology course, which is what we're going to do, but we're going to make it as interesting as we can. So here's a sample question off the AP test. The multiple choice variety here. So read along here with me. Which of the following scenarios is the best example of the mere exposure effect? So look through those 5 choices and think about it. And you may say to yourself, I don't know what the mere exposure effect is. There will be questions on the AP Psych test that I've not covered, that have not been in the summer reading book, that have not been in your textbook, which you'll get here this summer when you come into flight school or during the first weeks of school, or in the springtime when we get to go pick up books. You will learn about the mere exposure effect, but let's look at the definition here real quickly. It is a psychological phenomenon by which people tend to develop a preference for things merely because they're familiar with them. So 2 things here with the definition. A preference for things, meaning that you want something because of your exposure to it. And the second thing is, the only reason potentially that you're interested in it is because you've been exposed to that thing. As you look through these, you looked at these 5 choices, and there are 5 choices in the AP test. It is pretty obvious that choice C would be correct, that Hal begins to like a certain sports car after seeing it frequently on the road, even though he didn't like it at first. So that's the mere exposure effect. You're more likely to develop an affinity for something or a preference for something because you're familiar with it. So you're going to study all this year, and we're going to have AP type questions on our tests. There'll be at least 10 or 20 of these type of questions on every test. To me, you do this all year and you put your work in all year, you should take the AP Psych test, and these are the type of questions you'd be in for. Now, FRQ wise, we're not going to go through the answer on this one, but this is one that's pretty straightforward. We're going to look at these sample free response questions. Now, there are 100 multiple choice questions just like the one we looked at here. So there's 100 questions there. There are 2 FRQ questions. The test is weighted much heavily on the side of the multiple choice questions. However, the FRQ free response questions are doable, and they are doable because it's not like the type of thesis statement that you would need in world history or with the DBQ or US history with a comparison type question or change over time type question. If you're looking at this one, it says we've conducted a variation of Ash's conformity study in which participants made judgments about the length of lines. So you may not be familiar with the Ash conformity test. We'll get to it later in the semester because it's a social psych topic. But they randomly assigned participants to one of 2 conditions and told them that the study involved perceptual abilities. But it really wasn't about that. And that's typically, there's misdirection in all these kinds of experiments because you're going to try to test something that people aren't quite aware of. But in the first condition, participants estimate the length of the lines after hearing 5 people pretending to be participants. They're actually Confederates, and they give inaccurate estimates. So remember, we're looking at 1951 Ash conformity test and study, and the participants give inaccurate estimates in one of the groups. The second condition, participants are estimating the length of lines without hearing estimates of Confederates. So they don't even know that other people have guessed in a different way. It's pretty easy to expect, and it shows this for sure, as we expect participants in the first condition were less accurate in their estimates of line length. This is social conformity. You've got a group of people, often people that you don't know, who are saying line A is longer than line B, although it's not, and line B is the longest. You sometimes may fall prey to saying, and going along with the crowd and saying, oh yeah, it's that line. So that's great. This is the scenario. This is the abstract. So what do you have to do with it? How would each element below be related to the specific content of the experiment reported in the abstract? So you're going to relate the specific content that's listed below in the bullet points there with the content of the experiment reported. And part B, how might participants' estimates of line length be in the study be related to the following? And there's 2 examples. FRQs are straightforward. Pretty straightforward most of the time. There's a couple tricky ones, but we'll look at those. And there was one last year on the 2014 test that was a little bit tricky. And these get released like all the other AP tests, so we'll look at them. But how many points do you think that this would be worth? How many points are they looking for you to score? And this is just like any other AP test. Most of the essays aren't scored and then they take points away. They give you points as you do the things that are correct. Well, let's just go through the bullet points. Control group, 1 point. Deception, 2. Operational definition of the dependent variable, 3. Hypothesis, 4. Debriefing, 5. 6, of course, then is cognitive dissonance. And 7 is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You relate these things back to the question. Typically, I tell students to do 3 things. Define the term and use the term in the scenario as they've asked you to do it, and then also try to go above and beyond that. And this way, you're not cutting it too short, making sure that you know what they are looking for. 'Cause sometimes they're looking looking for more than what they state, which can make you angry, but that's the truth. All right, so let's get back to the summer reading book. You've got a chance to see what we're going to do in AP Psych and what the end goal is. Why are we reading this book, especially during the summertime? Don't we have better things to do? Well, 50 Great Myths Popular Psychology uses these popular myths as a vehicle for helping you to distinguish science from pseudoscience. And it's pretty important that you'd understand what's real science and what isn't. And it's surprising sometimes for some students to realize, wow, what I thought was right isn't the way it is. So it uses common myths as a vehicle for exploring how to distinguish between factual and fictional claims. It explores topics that readers often misunderstand, like opposites attract. Not necessarily. They really don't. People use only 10% of their brains. That's a good one for this summer. We'll look at that in some depth here later. Handwriting reveals your personality. Not really. We may read things into what we see, but there's not much scientific proof, no proof, that that happens. This provides what's called a myth-busting kit for evaluating folk psychology claims, and it teaches you some critical thinking skills through detailed discussion of each myth. Most people think of me as a social studies teacher. I'm in the social studies department, but really psychology is a science, a social science, but it's really more of a science, and we'll be looking at things in a really critical way, and sometimes we'll do statistics and math. We'll do some charting of things and graphing of things just a little bit to understand that. You've probably seen the Mythbusters on television, or you've heard of them before, but there's a good little Jiffy GIF, as I call them, at the bottom here. It says, remember kids, the only difference between screwing around and science is writing it down. And really what he's trying to say there is publishing your science and doing experiments, screwing around is sometimes could be an experiment. You're testing it out. And we'll see some of that. Now, I put this slide in here for a couple reasons. Number one, you can see those people who have come before you in AP Psych. There's many kids up here from my very first year, which is this group here on the left, to last year's group, which is, here's a group from the spring and the 2 classes I had in the fall. Well, they did not read this book. So if you ask one of them, hey, you had Psych with Mr. Duez, you had AP Psych, did you have to read summer reading? I heard there might be summer reading. There is summer reading. Hopefully you've figured that out since you're watching this. But pass the word along, because some students might not be so sure. We've had a really good run at things here with this course, and I've really enjoyed seeing it build, and hopefully it's had a good impact on students. And word of mouth has been good. The course has grown every year. Hopefully it'll continue to do that this year. So, what is psychology? Let's talk some shop here, then we'll get into some of the factors in the book. Psyche is soul. Logos is the study of a subject. So it's a study of the mind, and more specifically, it is and has foundation in philosophy and physiology. So you kind of combine the two. And we'll talk about this. We'll say, you know, psychology has a short history but a long past. And that means that as a science, it's not been around for a very long period of time. But all the way back through the Greeks, they have looked at what psychology is and tried to study it. Maybe not as a science exactly, but psychology is defined as the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. And it's really important that behavior is in there, because measuring someone's mental processes, although we're getting better and better at that with technology, being able to look at MRIs and those types of things, and functional MRIs in particular, we're able to see some of the things that happen in the brain. But do you really know what someone's thinking and the reasons for what they do? Sometimes it's apparent, and sometimes we can probably guess correctly. Many times, I'm sure we don't. So behavior and mental processes, it's kind of combined. Can you tell what someone's thinking by what they do? Sometimes you can. And so you study both of those things. So what's popular psychology, which is mentioned a lot in the book? You can see on the right there it says popular psych, or pop psych, or pop psychology is the concepts, theories about human mental life and behavior that are purportedly based on psychology and that attain popularity among the general population. Now, in the book, Lilienfeld mentions it's an amorphous industry that encompasses a sprawling network of sources of everyday information about human behavior. You'll find these on television shows, on the radio sometimes, and usually there can be a lot of errors and a lot of things that are just flat wrong that get mentioned, and isn't necessarily folk wisdom, but that common sense approach to human behavior leads to a pop psych type of idea forming, and that kind of a world gets pushed around, and we can't necessarily trust our common sense. Now, another thing that feeds into this is mentioned there in the first example is TV shows. You know, from Dr. Phil and Dr. Drew to Criminal Minds and The Mentalist to the show Lie to Me, Breaking Bad even in many ways, and the show Hannibal, which is quite a chilling show. These all use quite a lot of psychology. Sometimes they're using it in dramatic ways that probably aren't necessarily accurate, but that's the pop psychology culture anyway. So what we're trying to do is eliminate myth and separate that out from what is truly science or fact. So what is science? And on the right it says, the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. That's not a science definition in terms of psychology, it's just a science definition. On the left it says science is not common sense, and that really does bewilder some, and they believe, how can it be if I don't just necessarily think that it is? Science can seem impossible. Theories of natural selection, which when you say theory, people say, oh, that's a theory, that's not actually true. It's true until someone can prove the theory wrong. See, that's where the science comes in. And evolutionary psychology, which are interesting examples here of things that sometimes people are, they can be quite controversial because people just innately don't believe they could actually exist. Yet they hold up to scientific rigor again and again and again. Real interestingly, we'll talk about it in class, probably one of the leading evolutionary psychology voices in the world is at the University of Texas, and he's written many of the evolutionary psychology textbooks. So right here in our own state of Texas, we've got an evolutionary psychologist with a lot of weight. So the tool kit for Baloney is mentioned in here and in a few other places in the book, but it's a set of cognitive tools and techniques that help to fortify the mind against penetrations of falsehoods. And this was created by Carl Sagan initially, these ideas or these bullet points about what you should be looking for. And if a new idea survives examination through this toolkit of ideas, this Baloney detection kit, then it could be accepted, tentatively accepted. And there are precautions that need to be taken because there's a tried and true and consumer tested method. Belief bias, a correlation that's plausible, does not always mean it's causal. Excuse me. And what we'll talk about quite a lot is causation doesn't mean that it is, a correlation doesn't mean it's causal. But if you unlearn these tendencies, that's a good thing. Or you can really fall victim to them in life, and it wouldn't be a good thing or necessarily a healthy thing to do. Carl Sagan was quoted as saying, "I don't want to believe, I want to know," and that's about finding the truth. So the first of these Baloney kit ideas is independent confirmation of the facts. Makes sense. Number 2, encourage substantive debate on the evidence. 3, arguments from authority carry little weight. And they'll go on to explain this. Just because someone's an authority doesn't mean that they're always 100% correct. Putting an idea or theory to the scientific test will prove it to be true. Spin more than one hypothesis. This is important because you're going to try and test against human frailty of ideas. You know, we come up with an idea, we think it's our hypothesis. Well, we really want to defend that. To prove your hypothesis that you believe in so much, you must try to defend other hypotheses. So try not to get overly attached to your hypothesis. Goes in the same vein there. Quantify, which means that what's vague and qualitative is open to many explanations. So you got to quantify it. If there's a chain of argument, every link in the chain must work. Number 8 is Occam's razor, which you may have heard of before. The simplest answer must therefore be looked at because it probably is the best answer. And number 9, always ask whether the hypothesis can be, at least in principle, falsified. So these are all good ideas. And the last part there says to duplicate your experiment, see if you get the same result. A good scientific experiment could be duplicated by any scientist. They go through the same steps. If it can't be duplicated, well, then it's not proper science. Really, this book is about skepticism. And I think healthy skepticism is a really good thing. I'm not saying you should walk around this earth being a cynic or being negative, but you should take a double look at things and not fall victim to some things. Science is more than a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking, a way of skeptically interrogating the universe, and it's really looking for truth. And in this book, that's definitely what they're doing. Lilienfeld and company, they are putting to the test the myths that many people believe. And some of these myths could be very dangerous. So there you go. You might be a skeptical eagle, or a skeptical cat, or a skeptical cartoon character. Definitely a skeptical dog. Can't tell if a vicious dog-eating villain or just a vacuum. Why do these myths exist? Well, one reason is word of mouth. We hear something, repeated enough times, we tend to believe it. And even if it is unbelievable at first, because it just seems to have weight each time someone mentions it. We have a desire for the easy button, for the quick fix, to say, let's find the easy answer, like, where's X? Here it is. And we have this selective perception of memory. We remember our hits and forget our misses. So for every 9/11, which is a terrible event and terrible thing that's happened in history, we seem to forget all the other occurrences or all the other days then that terrorism didn't happen. One day in our nation's history has taken on quite a lot of weight. Your chance of dying in a terrorist attack is about as small as dying in a lightning storm or being struck by lightning. So, but we spend an awful lot of money on fighting terrorism, and not nearly as much money on, like, fighting lightning. It's an interesting way of looking at things. When you look at it scientifically and look at the numbers, that's kind of true. We have selective attention, and you'll really get a sense of this when we look at sensation and perception, that you do not see the world as it is. You often see the world as you want it to be. So why do these myths exist? Well, we infer cause and causation from correlation. So a good example of this is the logical fallacy, post hoc ergo prompter hoc reasoning. And it means after this, therefore because of this. And there's a really good video example here from YouTube about that, where they have a clip from the show The West Wing, and President Bartlett says to his advisor, to CJ, CJ, on your tombstone it's going to read post hoc ergo prompter hoc. And CJ, confused, says, okay, but none of my visitors are going to be able to understand my tombstone. Probably true, but you don't want to fall victim to the after this, therefore because of this phenomenon. And that can happen. You see something happen and you figure that if it came at this point in time, it must have been caused by the thing that preceded it. You have to be very careful because of that. So, and cause and effect are a big part of that, and we'll look at that as we look at the science chapter for sure, when we look at the experiments and research. So why do these myths exist? Exposure to a biased sample. Psychologists overestimate the difficulty of stopping smoking because they see only patients who come to them for help. And if you're only measuring the patients who come to you for help, do you have a true sense of these treatments? Will they actually work? They work for the people who want to be treated, potentially. Reasoning by representativeness, which occurs when evaluating the similarity between two things only on the basis of superficial resemblance. That means things like if A equals B and B equals C, then A must equal C. You have to be careful. It may seem simple, some of these examples, but there are some real trip points here that might come up, and they do in the book that you'll read here. You'll see some things that you'll say, well, that doesn't make sense because this is true, then therefore that must be true. Not necessarily. So why do the myths exist? We've got a lot of misleading media, film and media portrayals, like the movie Sybil, which is about a person suffering from multiple personality, or something called dissociative identity disorder. Many psychologists don't believe this is even a true thing, which I believe Lowenfeld is a disbeliever of DID. There are some cases that are interesting. We'll look at those and maybe we can see some truth in some of that, but you can take a little kernel of truth and it can often be exaggerated. And we fall victim to that all the time. It's how humor works. Jimmy Fallon there at the bottom of the screen, he takes just a little bit, just enough of a character and impersonates that, and it really seems like that's the person that he's portraying. And we've got this thing called terminology confusion, where because of words like schizophrenia, people think, well, that must be multiple personality disorder. It isn't. It's nowhere even close to it. Very, very different things. And like I said, some people believe that multiple personality disorder, or DID, dissociative identity disorder, which is what it's called today, that isn't even a real thing. We'll see. Surprising myths like opposites attract, spare the rod and spoil the child, familiarity breeds contempt, not necessarily, and that there is safety in numbers. There certainly isn't safety in numbers. The bystander effect is a very, very solid thing. If you're in a group of many people and you suddenly fall ill, you have less of a chance of someone in that big, huge group helping you than if you were in a smaller group of people. There are many reasons for this, but we'll look at some of those as we go through the semester. I want to spend a moment here looking at the summer reading book, 50 Myths, and how that relates to your textbook, which is Wheaton's Themes and Variations. This is a brand new textbook. It was used last spring, and I believe that's the only semester it was given out. It is fantastic. Really, really great. We have been using a textbook that is really old for many years, and Wheaton's book is tremendous. Really good, and I think that it is, it's not the most widely used book, but I think that it is a good thing that you have something that's a little bit off of what most students use, because we can look at what most students use, but you're looking at a different version of things, and that's very helpful for the AP test, so you can get an idea, a real competitive idea, because this is written in a really good way. But as you can see up here at the top, it says AP edition, and so there are questions in each chapter that are AP type questions. You should definitely focus in on those as we go through this semester, and I'll try to pull a section up here real quickly as we're talking through this one. And there they are. They're the AP review questions. They're usually in green there. They give you a good sense of what you should be looking at for the AP test. Now, throughout 50 Great Myths, and you see Scott O. Lilienfeld on the left there. He's a professor of psychology at Emory University. And Wheaton, I should mention, there's his picture at the top left. He is a professor of psychology at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. But throughout the book and throughout our textbook, you're going to hear a lot about research. And so here's the second chapter called Research, Enterprise, and Psychology. You'll see it all throughout 50 Great Myths. Lots of research in there to try to prove that these things that they say are myths are truly myths. This is a really nice talk. It's an hour long, but it's really good. If you get an hour over the summer and you want to check it out and think more about the book. In fact, he goes into a lot of what's in the book in this talk. This is from this past spring, or early summer, May 22nd through 25th, at the annual convention of the APS. Lilienfeld himself, you get a sense what the person's like, talks about pseudoscience, belonging in the classroom. And I'm going to play the very beginning of this for you, just to give you a sense of what it is about, if it allows me to play here. And then what I'm going to do is show you a little bit of what's on the left there.
Real honor for me to be here. And it's also a real honor for me to give this talk in honor of Dave Myers, who's really one of my heroes. I mean, Dave has really influenced me in so many ways. And in particular, Dave has inspired me in 3 ways, which I'll go through. Number 1, Dave wrote the most successful intro psychology book ever written, and deservedly so. It is a phenomenal book that has inspired at least 2 generations of psychology students, inspired me when I was undergraduate. I'm sure it's going to inspire many more people in the coming generations. And
so I want to pause it there and say, this isn't Myers' book. You may have a friend at another school who is reading Myers' book, and that's what they're using at their school. In Humble ISD, we use the Wheaton version, but that's not a bad thing. We'll discuss it more in class, but Myers' book is great as well. And a lot of what my presentations are built on for class are built around Myers as well. So
Dave, in part, actually inspired me, along with my co-authors, to co-write an intro book of our own. And if our book is 1/10 as influential and impactful as Dave's book, I will be amazingly delighted. Number 2, Dave has influenced me by his office. You look at Dave's office, and every book, every paper is in its proper place. It's utterly immaculate, impeccable. And that's really one aspect that I've really tried to emulate very hard in my career, as you can see here.
So he has a little bit of humor in the talk. I want to fast forward a little bit here and just show you a couple of things that are in the talk. He says he has a Sergeant Joe Friday approach, where just the facts man, where that's his approach has been in the past. That he wanted his introductory psych textbook, though, to look like an introductory to chemistry, really factually based. And it probably shouldn't be that way. And he mentions a couple of reasons why. As you go through here a little bit, there are so many things in popular science and popular psych, like astrologers find most distant object. Well, astrologer is not someone who's going to be looking at the stars. We see a lot of these pop psych myths and problems. Like 71% of people believe they've had a paranormal experience, not a paranoid, paranormal experience. 71% of people. That's kind of phenomenal. And even misconceptions among psychology students. I won't read these all to you, but expressing pent-up anger reduces anger. And in the book 50 Great Myths, they prove that isn't true. You go off and bang things and smash things and yell and scream. That doesn't help to subside your anger. It doesn't help your pent-up frustration. It just builds more frustration. And we tend to perceive patterns where they're absent. There's some good examples of that in here as well. And that our brains are soft-wired towards the false positive errors, which he explains. Good talk, and I wanted to show you a little bit of that, because as we go through these different myths, I'm going to read through them, and then there will be a gold star on here. That's the one one or two that I've highlighted with a couple extra video clips, and I won't play those video clips, but they're in here for you to play in the notes if you'd like to get some more information on these different myths. Now, you can read the book yourself. I'm not going to talk about every single myth. There's not really a reason to do that. We'll discuss many of them during the introduction to the class and throughout the semester. But the one that's right off the start here, that most people use only 10% of their brain power, that's a really widely thought of truth of life, and it's not even close. We don't use only 10% of our brain. Number two is some people are left-brained and others are right-brained. This leads to all kinds of confusion for people who believe that they can only do math or only write well or be creative, and it just doesn't function that way. Your brain is constantly using both sides, both hemispheres. Extrasensory perception, ESP, is well established. It's not. There's like no proof that it exists. It's the opposite. Visual perceptions are accompanied by tiny emissions from the eyes. This is a weird one, but many people believe falsely that to see, we shoot beams out of our own eyes, and they bounce back into our eyes. I don't know how in the world that would happen. I guess once you see the truth behind how vision works, you wouldn't fall prey to that. But myth 5, subliminal messages can persuade people to purchase products. Now, this is a good example. I'm not saying that you wouldn't be persuaded, but that persuasion, and they're not saying that either, there's some wiggle room in some of these. There's places where they sort of qualify this. There's a short-term situation where you might be persuaded, and it's fleeting. It disappears very quickly, and it would only occur if you would be more likely to purchase that product anyway. Say you go to a movie and they flash up on the screen subliminally. You can't see it, but it's up there. Popcorn, popcorn, popcorn. And then there's a break in the movie, an intermission, which they don't do anymore, but there used to be. Say there's an intermission, or right after the movie, you leave, and are you going to run out there and buy popcorn? Maybe. If you were already hungry for popcorn, if you already liked popcorn, and you were receptive to it. But it's not going to work for the whole audience isn't going to run out there and all buy popcorn. It doesn't work that way. So I've focused on this slide on a video clip, which is a really good one. What percentage of your brain do you use? And it says only 10% of our brains, true or false? And of course that is false. We use all of our brain, really, and all parts of the brain are connected and working. Now there could be some damage in some areas, but this probably came about because of William James' quote, "Most of us do not meet our mental potential." That doesn't mean that we only use 10% of our brains. There are 86 billion neural connections in your brain, and you're using them all the time. And the key to understanding the brain is that you don't have the entire network of neural connections firing at once. It is true that like 1 to 16% of cells are firing at one time, but that's moving around. It's not always the same 1 to 16% of brain cells. You're using as many as you have. DNews looked at this too. Do we really use only 10% of our brain? And they looked at some things that are kind of interesting, like from the last video. 2% of your body mass takes 20% of daily glucose to function. And why would this small part of your anatomy use up so much energy if it was only like using 10% of it? It just doesn't even make sense when you think about it that way. Another one here, and this is a recent movie that just came out this summer in 2014. The average person uses only 10% of their brain capacity. Today she will hit 100%. Unfortunately, Morgan Freeman's character says that, and he's like the voice of God, and he's lying. It's not true. And this is science fiction, whatever, but it's repeated so often to people that I think people will fall victim and say, oh yeah, wow, that wonder what would happen if we really used all of our brain. Would we have the abilities that Lucy has? No, you wouldn't. It's completely false. There are some things with the movie, and I haven't seen it yet, but there are some things with the movie that could kind of potentially be interesting, but that's not one of them. So let's look at chapters 2 and 3. Playing Mozart music to infants boosts their intelligence? No. Adolescence is inevitably a time of psychological turmoil? No. Doesn't mean that it wouldn't be, but it isn't for most. Most people experience midlife crisis in their 40s or early 50s? No. Myth 9, old age is typically associated with increased dissatisfaction and senility. Most older people are quite happy. Even people who are not wealthy or even ill, they typically have a pretty good happiness level. When dying, people pass through universal stages of psychological state. We don't even do that when we're dealing with grief. That's not true. There are certain stages that you might be comfortable with relating to, but people don't pass through those stages exactly. Remembrance of things in the past. So remembrance of things in the past. Human memory works like a tape recorder. No, it doesn't. And that's the one we're going to look at here, human memory. Hypnosis is useful for retrieving memories. No, it is not useful for retrieving memories. You might be open to some suggestion through hypnosis, but it's not going to help you with retrieving memories. Individuals commonly repress the memories of traumatic experiences. Not commonly. Most people with amnesia forget all the details of their earlier lives. They don't. So these are two of the videos I focused on here. How your memory system works, which is a good video to check out, and how do your brains make us forget. Two good ones to look at. So 4 through 6, I'm not going to read through all of these, but teaching old dogs new tricks, intelligence, dyslexia, learning styles. This is one that really bothers me. But students learn best when their teaching styles are matched to their learning styles. That is incorrect. You learn best when listening to a YouTube video while my dog is drinking. No, that's not really a true one, but a lot of educators have thought this to be true, and they've pushed this differentiated learning, and every kid in the classroom might have a different learning style, and you need to measure the learning style, and you need to help them understand how to learn. Maybe they're kinesthetic learners, or maybe they're going to be visual learners, maybe they're going to be acoustic learners and auditory learners. Not exactly. And so there's not a whole lot of science behind any of that. There were some books written, and you can look it up and see people have claimed that, but it's just not true. Altered states is all about consciousness, and so the one I'm focusing on here is dreams. And that's typically one we don't spend as much time on in class, because consciousness is a smaller part of the of the AP tests, as we'll get to later, but you'll see those videos in the next slide. I've got a feeling is about accuracy, measuring things like dishonesty, happiness being measured, ulcers being caused by stress, not true. A positive attitude can stave off cancer, incorrect. So as you're seeing here along the left hand side, I've got chapter 6, chapter 5, chapter 9, chapter 14. These are all topics that we'll be studying in Wheaton's textbook. So I've kind of linked those up with the different myths so you can see those. So let's look at these two. Do our dreams mean anything? And a great Vsauce video on what is consciousness. And this guy's pretty deep. He is very thorough. The next part here, 7 and 8, is the social animal. And know thyself. That is about personality. So chapter 12 there, personality. Now I moved chapter 12 to the front, and we typically look at that in the first unit just to add some spice to that. But that's the video I wanted to focus on in this part. And it's a video from Crash Course Psychology, so I wanted to have one of these in here so you can take a look at it. And Hank Green will walk you through like understanding the different trait theories and how to measure someone's personality. The next part here is sad, mad, bad, and we'll look at schizophrenia having multiple personalities. This is the last section of the book, 9, 10, and 11. And this is really what most students think we're going to spend the whole semester studying: psychological disorders and treatment of psychological disorders. But we've got to learn about everything else to get us to this point so that when you do look at this, you have a better understanding of it. And so don't be really upset to think, oh man, I thought we were going to learn about schizophrenia right away. We'll discuss it some, but it's really not going to be a focus of the course until towards the back end of it. And then all the pieces we've learned will kind of come together and it'll make more sense. Skills and pills is more about treatment here. And the last part that I'm focusing on, the last myth, is electroconvulsive shock therapy is physically dangerous and brutal. It isn't. Now, I remember that really well from the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. You can watch the clip there. It's pretty frightening. The way they used to do that, it is absolutely not the thing to do. But today, you can use an electrical current through the brain to do some really good things, kind of reset the brain. Could there be some memory issues potentially? Yes. But if someone's suffering through depression, or they've tried to commit suicide, or they have really terrible psychological disorders that are hampering their life, a little bit of electric shock might actually help them. And the last video up here that I'm going to share with you is a fantastic one. This is Eleanor Longden, and she talks about the voices in my head. Really good video, and a good one because it shows that those who are mentally ill are not easily seen. I mean, you look at her and you hear her talk, you'd never think that she suffers from schizophrenia, which she does. She has worked herself through that in many ways and found some treatment that works for her and ways to manage the voices that are in her head. These are very, in some cases, rare situations that people would have this occur to them, but her life story is really kind of motivational too. Really good talk. And the last thing I want to focus on here again is just reminding you these questions. As you come into class on the first day, have some of these questions ready and be thinking about them, because what I plan on doing is quizzing over the 50 myths. I'll give you a quick sheet of paper here. We'll go through some of them and see if you can pick them out correctly. We'll have a little discussion about that and see if you agree with each of the 50 myths or not. Did this work or not? And last thing here, check the website for anything additionally, and don't forget to email me if you have any questions at all. It's been a pleasure chatting with you here. Hopefully you'll enjoy the summer reading. If you don't, you don't. It doesn't mean you won't enjoy the course, but this will help you through the course, and I really think it'll help you do better on the AP test down the road in May. So without any further ado, as here, don't forget to be awesome. We'll see you next time.